Israel has obstructed the Commission's investigations and prevented its access not only to Israel and Gaza, but to the occupied Palestinian territory. So it's true that our work in the investigation, collection, and safeguarding of evidence has been hampered.
Our report barely scratches the surface. Our reports, there are 3 of them, almost 200 pages of them. And we barely scratch the surface of what has happened since the 7th of October. And as Navi has indicated, we will continue that work. These are the first instalments of, regrettably, a story that is not yet finished.
You know, I'm particularly concerned about issues that do not receive focus, such as 8,500 people being held in detention, just picked up, held incommunicado. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. That's what I did as a defense lawyer. And brought out the issue of torture that happens in incommunicado, indefinite detention. And of course, my husband was also detained, so there is a personal experience there. My own experience in apartheid South Africa, and the fact that we ended it with quite a bit of litigation in the apartheid courts, is what fills me with hope. So I want to emphasize that that would be my message to all those suffering in the present conflict, to be hopeful. It's difficult for them to digest that when, for close to 70 years, they've been under occupation. What I'm hopeful, and it's true, I was at the ICJ yesterday in another capacity, and so fulfilled in hope that for the very first time, the General Assembly has asked the International Court of Justice for its opinion on whether the occupation itself is unlawful.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us here at this press conference with the Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. We're pleased to have with us here today the chair of the commission, Ms. Navi Pillay, in the center, as well as fellow Commissioner Chris Sidoti, who wanted to take this opportunity to speak with you about the findings of their latest report. As you may know, the Commission of Inquiry was established by the Human Rights Council in 2021, and their latest report, as well as 2 additional detailed reports, were published last week on 12 June. And this morning, here at the Palais des Nations, the Commission has officially presented its findings to the Human Rights Council during an interactive dialogue with member states, which will continue this afternoon. So with that, we can begin. Commissioner Pillay will give some opening remarks, followed by Commissioner Sidoti, and then over to you for your questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Todd said, we just presented our report to the Human Rights Council's 56th session. This is the body we report to, but we also report to the General Assembly in New York, which we will do in October. Since 7th October, our commission has carried out 2 parallel investigations. First, into attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Israel on 7th and 8th of October, and second, into Israeli military operations and attacks in Gaza between 7th October and 31st December. And the report that we presented today summarizes the findings of our investigation, but because the investigation itself is so vast and so detailed, we accompanied this summary by 2 conference room papers that set out the details, and I do encourage you to look at those. Between you and me, I could see that some of the interveners in the interactive dialogue in the room had clearly not looked at the details, because there was some criticism that we had not investigated sexual violence sufficiently. What I like to emphasize is that our report represents the United Nations' first in-depth investigation of the events that took place on and since 7th October 23, It was based on interviews with victims and witnesses conducted remotely and during a mission to Turkey and Egypt. It's based on thousands of open source items which we had verified through advanced forensic analysis with the help of the UN-wide experts and various departments. So really a collaborative effort. We received hundreds of submissions, so I always emphasize there is such interest out there in people reaching out to us, especially since we are being denied access into Israel to see victims and families who have a right to have their voices and stories recorded at the United Nations. So I welcome the hundreds of submissions that we are receiving when we make a call for submissions. We rely on satellite imagery and forensic medical reports. Israel has obstructed the Commission's investigations and prevented its access not only to Israel and Gaza, but to the occupied Palestinian territory. So it's true that our work in the investigation, collection, and safeguarding of evidence has been hampered. It's not what we would like to do, which is go to the ground and talk to witnesses ourselves. In the 8 months since 7th October, tens of thousands of children, women, and men have been killed and injured. Palestinians, Israelis, and citizens of other states. Thousands of Palestinians have been detained and are being held incommunicado. And 120 Israeli hostages are still held in Gaza. So the enormity of this tragedy does overwhelm us. We are deeply disturbed by the immense human suffering, and we call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We also call for all member states to support ongoing accountability processes. We welcome the statements made by several countries in support of our report and the mandate, calling for a ceasefire and calling for accountability for violations and crimes. We were dismayed by statements questioning our mandates once again and calling into question our findings, but both Chris Sidoti and I still have an opportunity to respond to some of these interventions. So we are here then with the press before we can complete our work in the Council. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you. Chris, did you have any remarks?
I would like just to say a few personal things before we start, rather than canvassing the report. Navi has referred to the fact that the enormity of this tragedy overwhelms us, and it does profoundly. It's completely understandable how deeply traumatic the events on and since the 7th of October have been for Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora around the world, and for Palestinian people and the Palestinian diaspora. For Palestinians, they've experienced 70 or 80 years of dispossession, occupation, human rights violation, and this has now come on top of that. For Jewish people, the experience of millennia of persecution is immediate and direct. I'm neither Palestinian nor am I Jewish, and I have not had those experiences. But I try to understand how deeply traumatising what has occurred is, not only for those directly affected, but for all of those from the communities that have been affected. This work has been overwhelming for us as international United Nations investigators, as our chair has indicated. It has placed enormous stress on our staff. It's been a difficult assignment to deal emotionally and empathetically with the overwhelming nature of the events. Not just the statistics, although they themselves, just reading them, lead to a sense of despair, but also the personal stories. We have had opportunities to speak directly to people who were directly affected by what has happened. And it's their stories that are the most telling, and their stories that we need to hear the most significantly. Our report barely scratches the surface. Our reports, there are 3 of them, almost 200 pages of them. And we barely scratch the surface of what has happened since the 7th of October. And as Navi has indicated, we will continue that work. These are the first instalments of, regrettably, a story that is not yet finished. There are more violations that are committed every single day. And so our work is not finished, and our further reports will continue to deal with it. But I think that in much of the debate about geostrategy and international politics and dysfunctional United Nations agencies or organs like the Security Council and the limitations of courts, we often lose sight of the intensely human dimension of what has occurred. And I certainly want to refer to that and have that in the forefront of our minds as we have these discussions today. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Sidoti. Thank you, Commissioner Pillay. And now we can open the floor to questions. We'll take those from the room to start. On the right, we have Reuters. If you could please identify yourself and the media outlet you work for.
Good afternoon. Emma Farge from Reuters. Congratulations on your report, which has been praised for how comprehensive it is, no matter what side of the conflict you're on. I wanted to ask about your hopes and expectations for what happens next. Ms. Pillay, last time we spoke, you mentioned that you were having conversations with the ICC. I was wondering if you could characterize the nature of those discussions, and have you had any indication that they'll use this evidence? Thanks very much.
Sure, please.
First, let me say, Emma, our mutual respect of admiration for Reuters. So we do rely on your reporting as well. Thank you. I'm particularly concerned about issues that do not receive focus, such as 8,500 people being held in detention, just picked up, held incommunicado. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. That's what I did as a defense lawyer. And brought out the issue of torture that happens in incommunicado, indefinite detention. And of course, my husband was also detained, so there is a personal experience there. So I agree with Chris that we are independent information gatherers. We put this out there, and we want to be very fair, address all issues, but we fully appreciate the impact on victims in any conflict. So that's the importance of this work. However, my own experience in apartheid South Africa, and the fact that we ended it with quite a bit of litigation in the apartheid courts, is what fills me with hope. So I want to emphasize that would be my message to all those suffering in the present conflict, to be hopeful. It's difficult for them to digest that when, for close to 70 years, they've been under occupation. What I'm hopeful, and it's true, I was at the ICJ yesterday in another capacity. And so fulfilled in hope that for the very first time, the General Assembly has asked the International Court of Justice for its opinion on whether the occupation itself is unlawful, whether occupation is the root cause of the conflict, because that's what we're hearing from people on the ground wherever we speak. So something that had not happened in about 70 years has now happened because of the recommendations made by this commission. And all, Chris and I are sitting here, but really credit should go to the team that works, extraordinary hours to get this information out. So that's one aspect, that the ICJ is presently deliberating on whether the occupation itself is unlawful, and secondly, what are the responsibilities of states that support this unlawful activity. With the ICC, we welcome our own efforts in trying to reach out to the prosecutor. It took a number of efforts, I assure you. We didn't give up, but I think eventually when he saw us, he realized the value that we can provide, in that we are the only UN body with the investigative mandate. In fact, when we go back into the Human Rights Council, I'm going to say to the members of the Human Rights Council what an important thing they did by giving us this expanded mandate, which means although there's so much calls for investigation and set up a commission of inquiry, we were already there. People appreciated that. And when we made requests for information, the information pours into us. We have the full cooperation inside the United Nations, as I said in my report, so with forensic investigation, satellite tracking, we really have reliable information. So just to conclude, we have a memorandum of understanding with the prosecutor of the ICC. We've now furnished them with many, many tranches of information. As of 28th May, the Commission has shared more than 7,000 open source items with the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. And this is information that has been verified, and I've learned lots of new words, to geolocated, where it happens. Yeah, we link one video piece to another. Great effort. And we've also shared more than 2,000 open source items with the government of South Africa, because that's the channel to bring it before the ICJ proceeding. We will continue to furnish further information to them as we gather the information. So thank you for your question. I hope I've addressed it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Okay, another question from the second row, far left.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Pillay, for this briefing. Stéphane Bussard from Le Temps newspaper. You did mention in your introduction that you didn't address sufficiently the sexual violence issue. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? And my second question is, you did talk about the link between your report and what could be done with the ICC, ICJ. What specifically, in what terms could this report be very useful for the ICC and ICJ? Thank you very much.
So, Stephen, I was quoting what the ambassador of Israel and the ambassador of Palestine said in the hall there. Both seemed to think we didn't investigate sufficiently the violations that they are aware of. Well, our investigation must necessarily be hampered when we're not allowed there. And I put it like this, that by not giving us access to Gaza, Israel, and Palestine, they are denying the victims on the ground there from getting their voices, their authentic voices heard. So we will continue to pursue that. I feel really bolstered by the fact that the International Court of Justice in the South Africa application has that as one of the key orders, is to allow access to the UN's investigation team. Because everyone realizes you have to have reliable information for courts to act upon it. As United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights for 6 years, we supported the commissions, and I often felt that the important work was not being recognized. So I was very pleased. I'm now serving as ad hoc judge in the ICJ on the Myanmar matter, and I could see the importance of the Myanmar report, the information they collected. And based on that experience of mine, I am fairly certain that all parties, not only South Africa, but other parties who are joining in that application, will be looking to our report. And so I readily acknowledge that it's not what we had hoped to do. We would have done a much thorough job. Chris went to Turkey and Egypt and spoke with a number of victims. So you see, they are very willing to come to us. It's much better if we could go to them, and also to access those in detention, the hostages, their families. We do want to report on the treatment of hostages and their health conditions. It's very, very important. So that's it. There's a complaint of not sufficient investigation. We would like to address that. And I think that our reports will be relied on, particularly by the International Criminal Court. They need evidence. And as you know, the authorities in Israel have declared as terrorist groups some of the NGOs there who had announced that they would be providing information and cooperating with the ICC. So just for that statement, some of them have now been rendered out of action. So just to say that, you know, with all security in place, we are engaged with people with information. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll take a question in the back on the right. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi, thank you. Agnès Pedro from AFP in Geneva. I have a...
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, if you could speak up a little bit. Okay.
Yes, all good. So I'm Agnès Pedro from AFP in Geneva. I have a question. The family of hostages are telling us that the human rights of the hostages in Gaza are, on their view, are counting very little to the eyes of the UN. They think that there is a double standard. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think of those accusations? Thank you.
Perhaps I can respond to that, not in relation to the UN, because I don't speak for the UN, but I can in relation to the Commission of Inquiry. We've made it clear in this report that this is only the beginning, and I said that in my opening comments. In the report, we dealt with the treatment of Israeli hostages during the course of their abduction and taking to Gaza. We could not at that stage look beyond that. But in future reports, hopefully when we report to the General Assembly, but it will depend on how much information we have, we will be dealing with the treatment of all hostages, detainees, prisoners, both by the de facto authorities in Gaza and by the Israeli authorities in Israel. Not only were we unable in this report to investigate the 124 hostages in Gaza, we were unable to investigate the condition of the 8,000 to 10,000 prisoners in Israeli prisons as well. So that is very much on our agenda. But one thing I would emphasise in saying that is the importance of access to information. We cannot report if we don't have the information. There are hostages that have been released. We would like very much to talk to them. When it's appropriate to do so, taking into account their physical and psychological conditions. I mean, our first rule in evidence collecting is do no harm. So at an appropriate time for them, we want to talk to them. We want to find out what happened. And that's going to require the cooperation of the Israeli government. And if we can't do it adequately, it will be because we have been obstructed in our capacity to collect evidence. So we want to do it. We are collecting evidence already. We are not ready yet to report. We hope to be able to do so soon, but our ability to do so will depend upon the evidence we can collect.
Thank you. Let's take one question online. First from Laurent Sierro from the Swiss news agency. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. If I read the report correctly, you mentioned the word genocide once when you talk about the hate speeches that might incite to genocide. In future reports, do you plan to assess whether some of all of the 8 criteria for genocide are met in the current situation? Or do you precisely consider that it's a decision, as it is a decision that has to be made by the court, it's going to be only the work of ICJ and ICC. Thank you.
I think both of us would like to say something about this, yeah. That's a very good question, Laurent, because as the judge on the Rwanda Tribunal who delivered the world's first judgment on genocide, I tended to always say you cannot label something genocide until a court finds it so. But since then, since I'm no longer sitting as a judge there, I realized that how then are you going to track events leading up to genocide, indications of genocide, plausible indications of genocide? We are now strengthened because there is the provisional order decision by the ICJ. I think that strengthens us to look in terms of genocide. Many people are concerned about this. They do consider genocide as the most serious offense, and why aren't we dealing with it? I would also say that I have some constraints in the fact that our mandate comes from the Human Rights Council, and they have not put genocide into our mandate. But as I say, I've since changed my mind. I'll work closely with our team to follow whether the elements of genocide are being shown here in this conflict.
And I'd like to answer by just referring to the investigative methodology. I mean, when you conduct an investigation like this, you don't start out by saying, I plan to deal with genocide or I plan to deal with war crimes. The starting point is the collection of facts, evidence. And then on the basis of that evidence, forming conclusions as to what occurred, and then on the basis of those conclusions, applying the relevant law and coming to a legal analysis and decision. So we don't plan to do anything in relation to that. We plan to look at issues, but if the issue of genocide is an issue that needs to be addressed because of the facts that we find, then we'll have to consider whether we do it or not. And I put that last qualification on it because it is before the court at the moment, and we're also quite conscious of the fact that only 3 months ago, the Special Rapporteur on the Occupied Palestinian Territories, in her annual report, dealt extensively with the issue of genocide. And when there are more issues than we can possibly deal with arising from what has happened over the last 8 months, there's not much point in us delving intensively into questions that other UN independent mechanisms have looked at. We have not dealt with so many issues yet. So my answer would be, we don't plan that way. We will collect evidence. We will make factual findings. We will decide what the applicable law is to be considered in the context of them. And if that takes us to genocide and the discussion of genocide, then we'll discuss it.